In a forgotten wing of the Nuremberg archives, a single folder sits untouched. Its cover is marked only by a faded insignia and a word that almost looks ceremonial. Inside lie fragments, letters, sketches, schedules, records that suggest the existence of a ritual once practiced within the inner circle of Nazi Germany. Historians had dismissed it as rumor, the invention of defeated soldiers, or the product of post-war imagination. Yet the handwriting matches known signatures, the stamps are authentic, and the timing aligns with major political gatherings of the regime. There are descriptions of processions conducted at night, oaths taken before symbols older than the Reich itself, and objects transported under strict secrecy to mountain fortresses and candlelit halls. The more one reads, the more it feels like crossing from history into mythology. Nothing here speaks of battles or weapons. It speaks of belief, of men attempting to give metaphysical shape to power. A memo dated 1942 reads simply, "All things visible must serve the invisible idea." That phrase, repeated through the documents, becomes the key to the archive. It hints that behind every political order lies a secret ceremony, behind every command, a ritual justification. This is not the story of war as destruction, but of war as religion, a faith built by humans and worshipped through obedience. And as we open this file for the first time, we are not just revisiting a dark page of history. We are unsealing a forgotten cathedral of ideology, where conviction was more sacred than compassion, and reason knelt before symbol. The reports mention a chamber with no windows, hidden beneath the stone foundations of a government building in Berlin. Its purpose was never officially recorded, yet witnesses described it as a place of initiation, where silence was enforced and light existed only by permission. The walls were said to be lined with black fabric, the ceiling low, the air dense with the scent of oil and dust. At its center stood a table carved from a single block of oak, its surface engraved with an emblem resembling a sunwheel. Those who entered did so in uniform, but left with an altered sense of duty. It was there, historians believe, that ideology ceased to be an abstraction and became something ritualistic. The men of power rehearsed belief as if it were theater, binding themselves through repeated gestures, symbolic words, and a choreography of submission. They convinced themselves that history was not a sequence of choices, but a destiny already written, and their role was merely to enact it. The absence of windows became more than architectural. It became philosophical. To see only what the doctrine allowed, to breathe only what the state permitted, to think only what was sanctified by the hierarchy. In that room, authority became divine and morality optional. When the last record ends, the note reads, "Those who look inward will never question what surrounds them." It was a warning disguised as wisdom, the blueprint for a system that preferred darkness to reflection. Before the war reached its height, the regime had already transformed symbols into instruments of devotion. The swastika, once an ancient sign of renewal, was stripped of history and filled with new meaning: authority, purity, destiny. It appeared on banners, coins, and architecture until it ceased to represent an idea and became the idea itself. Citizens no longer saluted a leader. They saluted an emblem that promised transcendence through unity. Propaganda ministers understood this transformation as a kind of secular priesthood. Their task was to replace prayer with repetition, faith with spectacle. Processions, torches, songs, each became a liturgy rehearsed before the cameras of the world. But within the walls of secrecy, the same symbols were treated not merely as decoration, but as keys to power. Certain officials claimed these emblems resonated with ancient energies, that geometry and light could awaken forces beyond comprehension. Such claims were never proven, yet they shaped the psychological architecture of the state. The population marched not only under banners, but beneath invisible assumptions that obedience was virtue and dissent a form of blasphemy. To challenge the symbol was to deny the destiny it promised. In this way, politics merged with mysticism, and history became ritual. What began as a campaign for order turned into a crusade for meaning, and the flag no longer fluttered in the wind. It hung motionless, like a relic waiting to be worshipped. Within the ideological core of the regime stood a circle of men who were not soldiers or politicians, but dreamers of a darker kind. They called themselves historians, philosophers, and cultural guardians, yet their mission reached beyond scholarship. They sought to manufacture a mythology powerful enough to outlast defeat and reshape memory itself. Drawing from fragments of medieval legends, Nordic epics, and occult manuscripts, they designed a new cosmology where the empire was not a political creation, but a rebirth of an ancient order. Their offices were filled with relics, runestones, ancestral maps, and symbols copied from forgotten temples. Every narrative they constructed replaced fact with significance. It did not matter if something was true. It mattered if it could make people believe. One theorist wrote that faith is stronger than evidence, because faith cannot be disproven. That idea became the foundation of their propaganda. Museums were reorganized into shrines of destiny. Textbooks rewritten as sacred scripture, and the image of the leader painted not as a man, but as a vessel of timeless will. The architects of myth understood that to control the present, one must sanctify the past. By turning history into ritual, they transformed obedience into participation. Each speech, each banner, each march became an offering to an invisible order that promised purity through submission. They were not inventing lies. They were engineering belief. And belief, once given a story to inhabit, no longer needed truth to survive. By the late 1930s, belief had taken a physical form. Uniforms were no longer fabric and insignia. They were vestments, stitched with precision to erase individuality. The act of wearing one was both social and spiritual, a conversion from person to symbol. Each button, each stripe carried a coded meaning, and soldiers were taught that the uniform was their second skin, a visible declaration of belonging. In parades, the synchronized footsteps became a single heartbeat that echoed through cities. People watching from balconies described feeling swept into rhythm, as though resistance itself would disrupt the harmony. That was the true power of ritual, making conformity feel divine. The regime mastered choreography not just on stages, but in the streets and schools, transforming daily life into ceremony. Morning pledges replaced morning prayers. Children drew symbols instead of flowers. Even silence became performative, a pause dictated by unseen conductors. To doubt was to fall out of rhythm. The structure was self-enforcing, because guilt and pride worked together like gears in a clock. When asked later why they participated, many said they felt chosen, as if history itself had handed them a role. They believed that wearing the uniform meant serving something eternal, not realizing that eternity had been fabricated from fear and spectacle. The faith they wore was not inherited. It was manufactured, tailored to fit the contours of obedience. At the height of this transformation came a ceremony known only to those closest to the core of power. It was called the First Oath, though the name appears differently across records. It took place in secluded halls at night, where candles illuminated faces stripped of rank. The participants stood in a circle, each raising a hand toward a symbol placed at the center. a relic said to embody the soul of the nation. The words they recited were simple, but their effect profound. A promise not to truth or law, but to the will that claimed to speak for both. Once the oath was spoken, witnesses described a silence that felt heavier than any applause. It was the moment loyalty transcended legality. From that night forward, obedience was not a command, but a creed. Those who took the oath became the keepers of its secrecy, convinced that disobedience was not betrayal of policy, but heresy against destiny. The ritual ended with the extinguishing of candles, leaving only the echo of breath and the faint scent of smoke. Historians later debated whether this was a literal event or an allegory constructed after the war. Yet what cannot be denied is the pattern that followed. A nation bound not by governance, but by ritualized conviction. The first oath was less a ceremony than a mirror, reflecting the hunger for meaning that can turn any belief, however dark, into sanctity. As the war machine gathered momentum, a different kind of weapon was being forged. One made not of steel, but of ideas disguised as science. In laboratories that resembled temples more than research centers, scholars wore white coats like robes of faith. They spoke the language of biology, but practiced the art of mythology, reducing humanity to measurements, charts, and imagined hierarchies. The word purity became both a mathematical term and a spiritual goal, a justification for reshaping society in the image of an illusion. Reports describe teams of researchers cataloging physical traits, convinced that numbers could reveal moral worth. Yet beneath the sterile precision was belief, not evidence. Theories of superiority were presented as discoveries, but they were born of fear. The fear that chaos could only be conquered through control, that diversity was a flaw in creation itself. Propaganda amplified these theories until they became moral law. School children learned to calculate ancestry as if solving equations of destiny. The state's faith in pseudoscience gave its crimes a ceremonial logic. Suffering could be rationalized and prejudice sanctified as progress. Historians reviewing the archives note how official documents read like scripture disguised as research. Each table of data functioned like a verse. Each conclusion an act of worship toward an idea that demanded purity at any cost. In the end, these scholars did not discover truth. They consecrated cruelty with the symbols of reason, proving that even intellect can kneel before dogma when it is promised a higher cause. In the years that followed, the empire's machinery no longer needed argument. It needed ritual. Every act of aggression, every decree, was framed as a ceremony of duty. Orders were delivered like prayers, repeated until their meaning dissolved into rhythm. Officials no longer debated morality, they enacted it through procedure. A stamped document became as sacred as scripture, a speech as binding as a creed. Conscience was replaced by choreography. Those who signed papers believed they were serving history, not harming lives. In the glow of torchlight and the echo of marching boots, individual guilt disappeared, replaced by collective participation. The system had achieved what philosophers call moral anesthesia, the ability to do harm without feeling it. Records show how even mundane acts, writing names, sealing envelopes, approving transfers, were performed with ritual precision. Each gesture confirmed membership in a hierarchy that promised redemption through obedience. Some participants later claimed they felt nothing, as if the act had already been forgiven before it was done. That was the genius of ceremony. It transformed intention into inevitability. When questioned after the war, a bureaucrat wrote, "We did not believe we were evil. We believed we were necessary." In that single sentence lies the tragedy of a nation that sanctified routine over reflection. The true horror was not hatred, but habit, not rage, but ritual. Behind the visible hierarchy, another structure operated in shadows, a network of secret orders composed of officers and ideologues who believed themselves guardians of an ancient destiny. Their meetings were rare, their membership carefully chosen. They saw the war not as conquest, but as purification, a ritual designed to realign the world according to their mythic vision. In secluded estates, by candlelight and under symbols drawn from forgotten cults, they performed ceremonies meant to bind them beyond death. Documents recovered decades later mention vows of silence and initiation rites intended to erase doubt. Participants believed they were part of something larger than any government, a spiritual army whose battlefield was not land, but belief itself. Historians debate how much of this was superstition and how much was deliberate psychological control. Yet evidence suggests that these secret circles influenced policy, advising leaders on how to merge propaganda with mysticism. They argued that fear was temporary, but faith was eternal, and only by transforming politics into religion could they ensure obedience without question. Within these orders, myth became mission. The members saw themselves as priests of destiny, channeling the invisible through uniforms and decrees. Even after the fall of the regime, whispers of these gatherings persisted, not because of what they accomplished, but because of what they represented. The moment when ideology crossed the threshold from doctrine into devotion, and history itself became a ritual too sacred to doubt. Power in the regime was not maintained only through law or force, but through ritual repetition. Every system of authority relied on ceremony to preserve its illusion of permanence. The leaders understood that control required rhythm, not reason. Meetings began and ended with gestures that seemed trivial, salutes, chants, silence at predetermined moments. But these gestures rewired perception. They made obedience feel natural, even comforting. Each repetition stripped away hesitation until loyalty became reflex. The power of ritual is its ability to make the extraordinary seem ordinary. A person who repeats an act daily ceases to question its purpose. By aligning human behavior with ritualized motion, the state created an invisible machinery of control. There was no need for constant surveillance because belief itself became the warden. Citizens learned to police their thoughts out of habit. The architecture of cities reflected this design. Long avenues for parades, public squares shaped like arenas, all built to convert space into ceremony. Every street became a stage where the citizen was both performer and spectator in the play of power. Historians call this process ritualization of politics, a phenomenon where ideology is not spoken but enacted. The genius of the system was that no one felt coerced. They felt included. They did not live in a dictatorship. They participated in a ritual. And once control takes the form of participation, rebellion no longer feels like freedom. It feels like blasphemy. Among the countless gatherings that filled the empire's calendar, one event stands apart, an annual ceremony known as the Night of Symbols. Officially, it was a celebration of national unity, but documents reveal it was far more than a public spectacle. The event began after sunset when entire cities were plunged into orchestrated darkness. Then, one by one, torches ignited in perfect synchrony, spreading light like veins of fire across plazas and streets. The choreography was meticulous, every step timed to the rhythm of drums that echoed through the night. Participants wore insignias arranged according to rank, forming geometric patterns when viewed from above. What looked like celebration was in fact invocation. a mass performance designed to merge individual identity into collective form. Observers described an overwhelming sensation of unity, a warmth that erased fear and replaced it with belonging. That was the intended effect. The spectacle transformed ideology into experience, making belief something that could be felt in the body. No words of hatred were spoken, yet devotion to the regime deepened with each flicker of flame. The night ended with a moment of silence so profound that even the air seemed to hold its breath. Those who attended left convinced they had witnessed something sacred. It was propaganda executed as liturgy, proof that symbols could move hearts more efficiently than any argument. To stand in that light was to surrender to the beauty of order, unaware that beauty itself had been conscripted into obedience. The further one peers into the archives, the more the boundary between science and superstition blurs. Laboratories became sanctuaries of ideology, and data served as scripture for a new theology of power. The scientists involved were not all fanatics. Many believed they were advancing knowledge, yet their experiments were guided by a single principle: that the end justified the method. Their pursuit of discovery was tainted by devotion to an idea that demanded proof, even where none should exist. The phrase unholy science was later coined by post-war investigators to describe this fusion of intellect and ideology. Within the regime, researchers were urged to find evidence of superiority, and when evidence failed, they manufactured belief. Instruments were built to measure myths. Charts were drawn to give numbers to fantasies. What began as study turned into worship, with the scientist as priest and the laboratory as altar. The regime's leaders encouraged this transformation because it gave their ideology an aura of legitimacy. When questioned, they could point to graphs and equations instead of faith. Yet the faith remained. It simply wore the mask of reason. The tragedy was not that knowledge was misused, but that knowledge itself became ritual. Every hypothesis ended not in truth, but in reverence to the state's imagined perfection. As one historian later wrote, they replaced God with geometry. In that act of substitution, they turned enlightenment into darkness, and science into a prayer whispered to power. As the empire's reach expanded, a new kind of institution rose quietly behind the front lines. It was not a military base or a factory, but a research institute devoted to decoding the spiritual anatomy of civilization itself. The men and women who worked there called themselves scholars, yet their mission resembled priesthood more than academia. They sought patterns that could explain why nations rise and fall, convinced that every culture hides a secret frequency that binds people together. If that frequency could be harnessed, they believed, the future could be engineered. Their archives overflowed with manuscripts from medieval mystics, archaeological sketches, linguistic maps, and ancient myths cross-referenced with modern science. Each document was treated as a fragment of divine code waiting to be translated into political design. They spoke of destiny as if it were a formula. This hybrid scholarship blurred the line between research and revelation. To them, symbols were not relics of the past, but instruments of control. The more they studied ancient rites, the more they recognized reflections of their own era. The same hunger for order, the same desire to sanctify power. In their pursuit of meaning, they lost sight of morality. The scholars of shadows believed they were restoring lost wisdom, yet they were resurrecting superstition under the guise of enlightenment. Their greatest achievement was not discovery, but transformation. They turned myth into system, giving ideology the gravity of scripture and scholarship the obedience of faith. The scholars soon realized that power speaks in symbols long before it speaks in words. They began to study language itself as a weapon, exploring how certain sounds, rhythms, and phrases could shape thought without argument. They dissected speeches, rewrote textbooks, and tested vocabulary that carried emotional voltage. Words like honor, purity, destiny, and rebirth were repeated until they ceased to describe and began to command. The state adopted this linguistic alchemy with precision. Bureaucrats no longer issued orders. They issued mantras disguised as policies. Each phrase was engineered to resonate with the subconscious, replacing reasoning with reflex. It was not enough to convince citizens. They had to be conditioned. Public slogans were crafted with mathematical care, balancing simplicity with awe. Even grammar was manipulated. Verbs of action were replaced by verbs of duty, transforming human will into obligation. Over time, the population stopped discussing ideas and began reciting them. The language of power had achieved its purpose. It's silenced by saturation. To resist such speech was to sound foreign, and to sound foreign was to appear disloyal. Historians studying these documents later observed that propaganda did not rely on lies, but on repetition. It created a rhythm that drowned uncertainty, like a hymn sung too loudly to question. The tragedy was that once words lose their connection to truth, they no longer communicate. They consecrate. The nation spoke in unison, but no one truly said anything at all. Among the regime's most influential figures were the artists who turned ideology into spectacle. They were not forced into service. They were seduced by the promise of creating eternity through art. Filmmakers, composers, architects, and choreographers collaborated to sculpt the illusion of perfection. Every image they produced carried the weight of revelation. Statues were carved to embody virtues that never existed. Music composed to sound like destiny unfolding. The mythmakers understood that emotion could do what logic could not: erase doubt. They blended aesthetics with authority, transforming beauty into a delivery system for belief. In vast auditoriums and open-air theaters, they staged visions of unity so precise that even the audience became part of the artwork. The films that emerged from this movement were not mere entertainment, but rituals captured on celluloid, designed to be replayed until memory itself conformed. Each frame, each note, each column of marble reinforced the mythology of a flawless empire. Yet behind the splendor lingered silence, the silence of those erased to make the image pure. The mythmakers convinced themselves that art transcended politics, but their creations became the most persuasive politics of all. They built cathedrals not for gods, but for governments, and in doing so proved that beauty, when stripped of conscience, becomes the most efficient form of propaganda. Long after the war ended, their works remained, shimmering with skill and deceit, haunting reminders of how art can sanctify even the darkest lies. In the heart of the capital rose a structure unlike any other, an edifice designed not for function, but for feeling. It was called the Temple of Ideals, though no official blueprint ever named it that. The building was vast, its geometry precise to the point of obsession. Each corridor aligned with celestial coordinates, each window placed to capture the exact angle of morning light. Visitors entering its halls described a strange sensation, as if the air itself carried weight, pressing reverence into the body. Architecture became theology rendered in stone. The designers believed that if space could evoke awe, then awe could produce belief. Columns rose like petrified hymns, and the ceiling appeared to float, dissolving into shadow. At the center stood an altar of marble, engraved with symbols too ancient to translate, surrounded by flags and polished steel. Ceremonies were conducted here in silence, yet the silence was louder than any anthem. People arrived as spectators and left as participants, unaware that the building's design had guided their emotions as precisely as a conductor guides an orchestra. Historians who later studied its blueprints discovered hidden symmetries suggesting more than artistic ambition. The temple was an experiment in psychological architecture, intended to condition reverence through proportion. Its beauty concealed its function. It was not built to honor faith, but to manufacture it. The Temple of Ideals still stands today, repurposed as a museum. Yet those who enter say they can still feel the residue of devotion in its walls, as if belief, once built into stone, never truly dies. Far from the capital, scattered across valleys and mountains, stand remnants of monuments that once served as nodes in the empire's grand design. Some were amphitheaters for speeches, others observation towers aligned with the solstice, all built under the illusion that stone could immortalize ideology. Decades of erosion have softened their edges, yet the echoes remain. Tourists walk their corridors, unaware that every arch and pillar once carried symbolic intent. Even the choice of material held meaning: granite for endurance, limestone for purity, iron for strength. Each structure was a sermon without words, translating political ambition into sacred geometry. Archaeologists now study these ruins not for artistic merit, but for psychological insight. They reveal how power sought permanence through architecture, believing that if the mind could be impressed, the soul would follow. One diary recovered from a site engineer reads, "We are not building for men, but for eternity." That belief was the empire's greatest delusion. Eternity cannot be engineered. Yet there is a haunting beauty in what remains. The light that falls through broken arches feels like confession. Moss covers symbols that once demanded worship. Nature reclaims what ideology tried to fossilize, turning propaganda into relic. Standing in those ruins, one senses both triumph and warning. The reminder that every monument to control eventually becomes a monument to decay. The stones still whisper, but their language has changed. What once commanded obedience now speaks only of silence. By the final years of the regime, faith itself had become a product assembled with industrial precision. Ministries collaborated with scientists, artists, and architects to sustain belief as if it were an energy source. Everything was calibrated: ceremonies timed to music, lighting designed to synchronize with emotion, public events measured in psychological impact. It was the culmination of decades of experimentation, religion stripped of transcendence and rebuilt as machinery. Faith was no longer spontaneous, it was engineered. Citizens were immersed in symbols from childhood, trained to feel devotion at specific cues, conditioned to associate beauty with loyalty. Propaganda ceased to persuade because persuasion was no longer necessary. People did not need to be convinced when they had been programmed to revere. What made this system extraordinary was its efficiency. It consumed imagination and returned obedience, leaving no space for doubt. The creators of this faith saw themselves as scientists of the soul, uniting art, technology, and myth into one apparatus of control. Yet even among them, a few began to sense the paradox. A belief manufactured too perfectly loses its mystery. A ritual rehearsed too often loses its meaning. As the war turned against them, cracks appeared not just in fortresses, but in conviction itself. Engineers of faith discovered that while they could design worship, they could not design hope. And without hope, even the most disciplined ideology collapses into ritual without purpose. A ceremony still performed long after everyone has forgotten why it began. As the war deepened, the streets of Europe became corridors of ritual. Processions stretched for miles, their symmetry both hypnotic and haunting. No one spoke during these marches. The sound was not of words, but of synchronized footsteps and the faint metallic rhythm of metals brushing against fabric. Observers described the atmosphere as sacred, though no prayer was spoken. It was unity rehearsed to perfection, faith performed in motion. Each participant carried not a weapon, but an expression of devotion, eyes fixed ahead as if guided by an unseen conductor. The regime understood that silence could be more powerful than speech. When thousands moved together without a sound, their obedience resonated like a hymn. The spectacle was meant to erase doubt, to make individuality feel small, almost shameful. Foreign journalists who witnessed these marches wrote that they seemed less like political events and more like collective awakenings, a civilization moving in trance. Yet beneath the precision was exhaustion, the kind that comes from surrendering thought to rhythm. Those who faltered were absorbed back into the formation, their hesitations swallowed by order. The silent marches were not just demonstrations of loyalty, but ceremonies of surrender. They proved that when a society learns to march in unison, it no longer needs to be convinced. It only needs to be directed. And in that direction, the line between discipline and delusion fades until neither can tell the difference. Among the archives recovered after the fall of the regime were thousands of personal letters written by citizens, soldiers, and officials. Most were never sent. Some were hidden, others destroyed and later pieced together from fragments. They reveal a quieter war, one fought inside the human spirit. A teacher wrote to her sister that she no longer recognized her students, that the children spoke in slogans even during play. A soldier confessed that he dreamed not of victory, but of silence, a world without drums or orders. A young clerk described feeling proud and terrified at the same time, as if he were serving something holy and monstrous all at once. These letters show what public rituals concealed: doubt, fatigue, and the slow erosion of self. Yet even the act of writing them was dangerous. To question the system was to betray faith, and betrayal was a sin punishable not by law, but by shame. Many writers disguised their doubts as poetry or prayer, trusting that metaphors would hide their meaning. They hoped that someday someone would read between the lines. For historians, these letters are more than confessions. They are fossils of conscience. Each word captures the moment when loyalty collided with awareness. They remind us that inside every ideology, however absolute, there remain whispers of humanity that refuse to be extinguished. The regime controlled speech, but it never fully conquered silence, because silence can also hide resistance. As cracks began to appear within the empire, new voices rose to restore its fading certainty. They called themselves visionaries, interpreters of destiny, men who could translate chaos into meaning. These were the prophets of order, philosophers, generals, and mystics who claimed to speak for the spirit of the nation. They toured cities delivering sermons disguised as speeches, urging people to see defeat as purification, loss as prophecy fulfilled. Their words blended theology with politics, offering redemption through sacrifice. Crowds gathered not to be informed, but to be reassured that their suffering had purpose. The prophets exploited the same hunger that had built the empire, the longing for destiny, the fear of insignificance. They declared that the nation was chosen, not by gods, but by history itself, and that every hardship was a test of faith. In private, some of these men admitted doubt, yet in public they spoke with the confidence of revelation. Their charisma filled the vacuum left by disillusionment. People no longer sought truth. They sought comfort in certainty. This was the final mutation of ideology into religion. It no longer required victory to survive. It required believers. And so, The prophets of order preached not to save their country, but to preserve its mythology. When history becomes scripture, failure becomes martyrdom, and no lesson is ever truly learned. The empire was already collapsing, but its faith remained unbroken, chanting into the ruins that order, even in destruction, was divine. When the empire began to crumble, its people discovered that belief exacts a price far higher than obedience. The system that had once promised certainty now demanded sacrifice. Cities burned, yet official broadcasts still spoke of destiny. Families fled bombed neighborhoods clutching portraits of leaders whose voices could no longer reach them. The same rituals that once united them now rang hollow against the sound of sirens. But the conditioning of faith was not easily undone. Many continued to salute invisible banners, convinced that endurance itself was proof of righteousness. It was as if surrender would mean betraying not just a nation, but the meaning of their own lives. Letters from survivors describe the confusion of waking from collective devotion, the disorientation of realizing that loyalty had replaced logic. One woman wrote that she had stopped praying not because she lost faith, but because she no longer knew to whom she had been praying. The cost of faith was not only destruction, but emptiness. When belief becomes absolute, it devours the very humanity that created it. The ideology had promised transcendence but delivered ruin, a paradox too painful for many to face. Some sought redemption by denying their past, others by confessing it. Yet history does not absolve, it records. The lesson left behind is quiet but enduring. Faith without conscience becomes its own god, and gods built by men have never been merciful. When the war finally ended, the land was covered not only in rubble, but in symbols. Flags lay buried under debris, statues blackened by smoke, and cathedrals of ideology reduced to silence. In those ruins, people began to write again. Diaries appeared from attics, poems from cellars, fragments of confessions found in abandoned offices. They were not declarations of guilt, but of bewilderment. How had devotion turned into destruction so seamlessly? Former officials described the eerie calm that followed the fall, a silence that felt heavier than any gunfire. Some tried to rebuild their faith in smaller forms, turning to religion, philosophy, or art to fill the void left by the collapsed myth. Others refused to look back, choosing amnesia over understanding. But even in denial, traces of belief lingered, haunting language, shaping memory. A soldier returning from the front wrote, "We buried our certainty, but it still breathes beneath the ash." The ashes of conviction are not easily swept away. They cling to generations, carried through stories and silences alike. For historians, these remnants are both evidence and warning. They show that conviction, once purified of doubt, becomes combustible. Every movement that claims moral perfection carries within it the spark of its own destruction. The ruins do not simply mark an ending. They mark a cycle. The moment when humanity must decide whether remembrance can triumph over repetition. The end did not arrive as a revelation, but as fatigue. The parade stopped, the chants faded, and the once synchronized nation fell out of rhythm. Factories that once produced weapons of faith now stood empty, their walls echoing with the ghost of machinery. The leaders who had commanded belief vanished into hiding or denial. Without their presence, the rituals lost coherence. The people who had once marched in unison now wandered aimlessly through cities that no longer believed in themselves. It was as if the entire country had been performing a play, and suddenly the script was gone. Churches reopened, but their pews were filled not with worshipers seeking salvation, but with witnesses searching for understanding. Philosophers began to speak of moral exhaustion, psychologists of collective disillusionment. The ceremonies that had once defined the empire's identity became memories too heavy to repeat and too shameful to celebrate. In their place came silence, not imposed, but chosen. It was the silence of a nation mourning its own illusion. The collapse of the ceremony was not just political, it was spiritual. When the curtain finally fell, it revealed no villains or heroes, only human beings staring at the emptiness where faith had once lived. In that emptiness lay the first possibility of renewal, fragile but real, the quiet beginning of remembrance before the next myth could be written. In the aftermath of collapse, the world turned its attention to understanding what had burned and why the flames had spread so far. Investigators entered offices left intact by chance, shelves filled with folders untouched by ash. Inside were blueprints of ideology disguised as administration, the machinery of belief rendered in paper and ink. The war had ended, yet the documents breathed with an eerie life. Each memo, each stamped decree, was a relic of how ordinary procedure had been sanctified into destiny. The men cataloging them wore gloves, as though handling something radioactive. They realized that the true weapon of the regime had never been its armies, but its ability to turn conviction into law. To study these papers was to read the anatomy of fanaticism. The report spoke of quotas, targets, ceremonies, all described in language stripped of emotion. It was not hatred that filled these pages, but precision, the kind that gives cruelty an aura of professionalism. In courtrooms across the world, witnesses spoke not of monsters, but of men who believed they were performing necessary work. The fire that consumed nations had been lit by bureaucracy and belief acting in perfect harmony. Historians called it the triumph of the ordinary, the moment when faith no longer needed passion to sustain itself. What survived the fire were lessons, but few were ready to learn them. Humanity had defeated an enemy on the battlefield, but not yet the one that hides in obedience dressed as virtue. As post-war governments rebuilt, certain archives disappeared. Some were destroyed deliberately, others misplaced in the confusion of reconstruction. The missing records became their own mystery, a void in which speculation thrived. What was hidden? What truths were too dangerous for a world eager to forget? Decades later, fragments resurfaced in private collections and sealed vaults, revealing the continuity of secrecy even after defeat. The documents that survived show the meticulous effort to erase not just evidence, but meaning itself. Names were blacked out, dates altered, symbols replaced with neutral terms. It was as if history were being rewritten in real time, a second purification disguised as restoration. The goal was not to deny the past outright, but to dilute it, to turn conviction into ambiguity, so that responsibility would fade into confusion. Historians tracing these absences discovered that silence can be more deliberate than speech. When archives vanish, myths rush in to fill the gap. Conspiracy replaces documentation, and memory becomes a battlefield where truth and interpretation exchange uniforms. The lost records are not merely missing, they are mirrors of denial. They remind us that forgetting is never accidental. It is organized. And in that organization lies a warning. Every society that worships certainty will eventually rewrite its own history to preserve it. The empire fell, but its instinct to control information survived, wearing new insignias and speaking new languages. The fire had ended, but the smoke had found new air to breathe. In the years that followed, survivors began to speak. Their testimonies were hesitant at first, voices trembling before microphones in courtrooms, classrooms, and film reels. Some spoke from guilt, others from grief, and many simply because silence had become unbearable. The world listened with a mixture of horror and disbelief. How could millions participate in something so vast, yet so personal? The witnesses described not only what they saw, but what they felt. The slow erosion of empathy, the intoxication of belonging, the relief of certainty. They spoke of moments when the world narrowed to a single command and when compassion felt like betrayal. Each account chipped away at the myth of inevitability, revealing the machinery of choice beneath the structure of obedience. But testimony is not merely remembrance. It is resistance. To speak is to reclaim meaning from the void left by propaganda. For many witnesses, the act of telling was itself an act of rebuilding identity, yet their stories were often met with fatigue. People wanted closure, not confrontation. Some nations preferred silence. Others turned memory into ceremony, safe and distant. But the witnesses persisted, repeating their words for generations that would inherit neither their guilt nor their clarity. Their voices remind us that the past does not end. It reverberates. Memory, once spoken, demands response. And in every retelling lies the same quiet question. If belief could consume them, could it not consume us again? Years after the war, when the smoke had cleared and nations had redrawn their borders, the symbols once buried in the ruins began to reappear. They surfaced not as banners, but as motifs, embedded quietly in art, fashion, and even architecture. The same shapes that once summoned fanatic devotion were now reframed as aesthetic choices, stripped of context, but not of power. A generation born after the conflict saw them as curiosities, unaware of the weight they carried. Museums displayed them under glass. Textbooks analyzed their geometry, and films borrowed their imagery to evoke mystery or menace. Yet with every reappearance, the line between remembrance and repetition blurred. Scholars warned that symbols never die, they only change languages. The swastika, the eagle, the sun wheel. Once emblems of a fallen empire, still possessed the capacity to hypnotize when detached from meaning. Ideology had dissolved, but its grammar survived. In a world saturated with media, images replaced sermons, and the old iconography found new hosts. Some used it to provoke, others to profit, few to understand. It was as if history, unsatisfied with being studied, demanded to be reenacted in fragments. The return of symbols proved that forgetting is not the opposite of remembering. It is its shadow. When meaning fades, allure grows. And when societies fail to teach why something was dangerous, they inevitably rediscover how beautiful danger can appear before it strikes again. For those who study this era, the past is both a duty and a burden. The historian stands between memory and myth, tasked with transforming chaos into comprehension without surrendering to the seduction of certainty. Each document examined, each testimony recorded, is an encounter with the question that haunts every archive. Can knowledge prevent repetition, or does it merely describe it afterward? In the quiet of the reading room, surrounded by papers that once dictated the fates of millions, the historian confronts the mirror of power itself. To write about darkness is to risk absorbing its logic, to analyze cruelty without normalizing it, to narrate belief without rekindling it. The dilemma lies not in finding facts, but in preserving empathy amid the data. How does one speak of atrocity without aestheticizing it? How does one teach what happened without allowing horror to become spectacle? The historian learns to walk this narrow path, aware that every word chosen will shape how the next generation imagines the unthinkable. The danger is not that people will forget, but that they will remember wrongly, reducing tragedy to trope and ideology to entertainment. In this sense, the historian is not merely a chronicler, but a guardian of proportion, reminding the world that evil does not appear as chaos, but as order perfected. The challenge is to remember without worshiping memory, to know without inheriting its poison. Night falls over the archives once more. The lights dim, and the pages that once trembled with history rest in silence. The story of the twisted rituals of Nazi Germany does not end in revelation, but in recognition. What began as a study of the past becomes a meditation on the present. Every empire that worships its own ideology eventually builds its temple on hollow ground. Power seeks to immortalize itself through ritual, yet every ceremony contains the seed of collapse. The historian closes the final folder and looks through the window where the city hums with modern life. Crowds, screens, slogans, symbols reborn in subtler forms. The faces have changed, the languages have evolved, but the patterns remain. The rituals of belief have simply found new altars. Technology, nationalism, identity, consumption. Humanity continues to kneel before what it creates, mistaking invention for destiny. Perhaps that is the true curse of civilization, not its brutality, but its forgetfulness. The past warns not through ghosts, but through reflection, asking whether we recognize ourselves in what we condemn. The story of those rituals is not distant, it is cyclical. It reminds us that power, when sanctified, becomes faith, and faith, when unexamined, becomes blindness. The final reflection, then, is not about them, but about us, about how easily enlightenment can become ritual, and how every generation must decide whether to repeat the ceremony or finally break the spell.